Today. I'm Lynne, the Adult Services Librarian at Kimball Library, a few doors down, and we were delighted when Sara Tucker asked us if we would host this author reception today. We have partners, Chandler, for supplying this wonderful room and setting it all up for us, and of course Vermont, which is the writing studio that Sara Tucker and her husband Patrick Texier lead. Sara has been a great friend to the library for years now, as was her mother, Idora. And she has been, over the years, doing several writing workshops. She donates her time and her talents and her encouragement to her students. And as a result, we have some writers here to tell us about their experience. Thanks for coming.
A few years ago, Patrick, my husband, after we had published the first of the Hale Street Gang anthologies, collection of writing by the seniors of the members of the Randolph Senior Center, Patrick took that book to France on a trip, and he also took 3 little books that my mother had written. One of them was teaching. These are books that we had printed in the back of his gallery on a LaserJet printer, and we cut them with this contraption we called the guillotine and hand stapled them. So he goes to France with these books and he showed them to his mother. And he said, "Mom, I'd really like you to write some stuff about your life." He was particularly interested in her memories of Les Baux. Les Baux is a village in Provence, and this is where his mother had grown up in the 20s and 30s. And it was also where Patrick spent the first few years of his life. And it was one of those sort of ancestral homes where every summer, every school vacation, he would return. This is a place that was dear to him and to his mother as well. Although when she was a teenager, she couldn't wait to get away from it. So he said, "Mom, would you write some stuff down?" And inspired by these books that we had been creating for people in Randolph, she did. She went to the supermarket next door and bought a series of lined notebooks and by hand started writing her life story. And then she put those notebooks in a cupboard, and I found them years later after she died. Because she wrote this. She was so sure that nobody would be interested that she just decided not to show them to even the kid who had asked her for them. So let me just tell you a little bit about what she wrote about. Les Baux is close to Arles, where Van Gogh had several productive years. The countryside is beautiful, and the town, the village itself, is on this rock outcrop. Beaux is spelled B-A-U-X. This is where bauxite comes from. And you can see the quarries to this day, where the miners inscribed their names on the wall. It's beautiful stone. The village climbs up this very, very steep cliff, and from up, there's a castle on the top. And from up there, you can see all the way to the sea. The view is stupendous. And so it was on the grounds of the castle, which today are, you can't walk on, you have to follow a little path. But that was where she played with her friends. And when she was born in 1924, of course there were tourists coming there, but there were nothing like the numbers of today, because touring by motor car was a new thing. And so her mother had the souvenir stand in the parking concession. There was not a lot of parking going on, however, and her stepfather was the custodian of the castle. And so she wrote about all of that, and she wrote about the people in the village that were important in her life. She wrote about the schoolmistress. This was a village that there was a mix of artists and writers who were the relative newcomers, and very old Provençal families. And most of them were very poor. And you would see people regularly every day out gathering their firewood and foraging for food. So she wrote about people like the vegetable seller who delivered vegetables to because everything had to be brought up from the valley, even the water. She wrote about the water carrier. She wrote about 1010, the jail keeper. They had a jail, and you could end up in it if you misbehaved. She wrote about the schoolmistress, because the school still was a school. The priest, she just wrote about, a murder that took place, and it made international headlines, this murder. Well, she wrote, it was never solved, and she wrote her own kind of speculative account of what might have happened. She wrote about a very disagreeable sculptor by the name of Louis Jou, who was famous. His studio is now a museum. And she wrote about what he was like. And he was very curmudgeonly, and his wife used to say that every time he came home from being away, she had an attack of sinusitis. And so she told little stories about him. She wrote about a poet by the name of Charles Corneille, who was renowned as he belonged to a society of poets whose mission was to preserve the Provençal language. She wrote about him and the little parties that he had at his house. And so she wrote about all this stuff. Well, today, when you go to the village, 2 million people pass through this village every year, tourists. It's listed as one of the 100 most beautiful, this is an official designation, one of the 100 most beautiful villages in France. But nobody actually lives there anymore. The school is not a school. You can't buy a stamp in the post office. It's just visitors and the people who work there in the tourist industry. So I thought that, people who go there would be interested to know what it was like when people actually did live there, because it's remarkably well preserved. It still looks pretty much as it did when Mireille left in 1944. So she wrote all of this about, I should hold up the book at least. Here, Sarah, I'll do this right. She wrote all of this because she was inspired by this group of Randolph contemporaries of hers who were writing about many of the same events in their own lives. Things like the outbreak of the war and getting married and meeting somebody as war was breaking out, and then your husband disappears. But the people who wrote the Hale Street Gang never imagined that anybody beyond a few grandchildren would be interested in their story. And of course, Mireille didn't imagine that anyone would be interested in her story either. So the point I wanted to make here is that you can't know. You cannot know who's going to be touched by your story. All you can do is write it down. And so I wanted to introduce two of the writers who have been writing together for, as long as we've been here, as long as Korongo has existed. I think there are 9 in the group. There are 9 who contributed to an anthology. But these women, they're all women, have been writing together for years without any thought of publishing. Later on, we'll have a discussion. I'm going to give people a chance to mingle and escape if they need to, where we can talk a little bit about some of these things like writing versus publishing. But Theresa, Bryant, and Joan Feierabend are here today to talk about their writing group and their anthology, which is called Toward the Glimmer. Let's welcome Joan and Theresa.
We have a little bit of a size difference here. I'll bend and she'll reach. How's that? Is that okay? Can you hear us? No. Okay. I came with a costume. This is our book, Toward the Glimmer. And I'm going to introduce this first, and then Theresa's going to talk about how we got together as a group and what the group does for each of us individually, and she's going to do some reading. I'm not going to do any reading because I want to promote writing, not so much what I wrote, but what you might write. we put together this group as kind of love story to Sara Tucker. Sara has started our group, and she encouraged us and did it for free, which was a big part of it. She was a cheerleader. She comes and visits us every time that we meet, and every time that she's in the United States and we meet. And she is a true believer in getting people to write. So thank you, Sara. We have, hold these for me. We have a group of 10 women who put this book together. And there's a picture in this, and I'm dressed like this. And I brought this because we put together, we had so much fun putting this book together. We've been writing together, reading each other's pieces, paying attention to each other's lives for years. And Sara mentioned putting a book together, so we decided to go ahead and do that. And we decided to use my artwork because I was the visual artist in the group. And the year that I moved, I was doing a project of a daily drawing that took all of my art time because I was about to move and I didn't want to move hundreds of paintings, of books like this, 12 of them. That was easier. So I had all these books with all these drawings, and I had used them in the writing group a little bit, and I brought in some of the books and had everybody in the group take one and look through it and pick out one's drawings in the book that might be appropriate, and they picked out this one. So that's how the drawing got on the cover, and Theresa named it. You want to tell them why you named it?
Well, if you look at the cover of the book, there's a woman wearing a hat, wearing a coat. She's looking away, not toward you. And so to me, and it's unclear, light rather, a little darker, darkness. So it seemed mysterious to me. It seemed like a person on a journey. Her feet are not together. One foot is going forward. So she's moving toward somewhere. She's anticipating going somewhere. So to me, that said it was mysterious. She's on a journey. She doesn't quite know what the truth is if she's looking for truth. So maybe if in her movement she came close to it, maybe a glimmer of the truth would come. And that's something to reach for. So as we sat there, we bantered around a lot of things. This didn't just come out beautifully, but we sort of played with words. But glimmer seemed like a word that had mystery and a shimmer to it. And so I said, well, why don't we try Toward the Glimmer? So that's where the title came from. And Joan's a beautiful artist, as you know. And if you get a chance to take a look at the picture, there is a group picture of us inside. And somehow, Madame came up with this, she or Monsieur, we have no idea how this came about. And we got the book a couple of weeks ago, and it was perfect. It was perfect. You know, a little more of the darkness and the mystery on the back in the hinting of this silhouette of us. So we think it's a perfect cover. We love it. Thank you, Sara.
Okay. So the book became a book of stories from at least two from every one of the writers, and we chose those stories for each other. As a matter of fact, the story that I have in here, I wouldn't have put in there, but one of the writers from our group said, "Oh, I want that one," and coincidentally, that particular story had been lost in a computer crash, so I didn't even have it. And she said, well, I think I have a copy of it.
It was Nancy Reed.
It was Nancy Reed, and she had asked me if I would send her a copy of that story. So I sent it to her, and she had a copy, and I put it in, but I added a little bit of today to the end of the story. If you read it, it's an interesting anecdote. So. That's about all I want to talk about in the book. We had a really good time putting it together. It was a collaborative effort, everything that was written in the book that was a group projects, we wrote together as a group. The wording of the dedication, the wording of the description of the book, and so forth, and the stories that we chose. Theresa is now going to tell you a little bit about our group, and then we're going to try to talk about the group together. That's an experiment.
A little banter here. I think each of us, there are 10 or 11 of us now. We have a new member. She's here someplace. Here. And we all came to this group in sort of fits and starts, bits and pieces. We met Sara at different times. The day I actually met you, you were babysitting the exhibit downstairs of the Hale Street group, and I think it was the last day. I had no idea who you were. And I was this person who always wanted to write and never had time to do it. I've spent most of my life writing for other people in business modes, and so that's how I met Sara, and she encouraged me to come over to the gallery and to take a course. And if other members were here, they'd tell you when they met Sara. And she held workshops here and yon, mostly at the gallery, and then she held them at her home. And then, of course, Patrick and Sara moved to France, and so we needed a place to be. There were a number of us who tried to get together, and so we sort of rotated around, and different people would show up, and then suddenly a group of 11, 9 initially, sort of just congealed, and that's who we became. And so from then on, maybe for about 2 years almost, we've continued to meet. Lydia and Pat, who I'm sure many of you know, when they moved to Morgan Orchards, decided, well, why don't you come there to meet? We met there several times, and now that's sort of become our home. So we meet one time a month, normally on a Thursday, because that seems to work out best for us. You can write about anything you want, but we also created a prompt jar. And so at the end of every meeting, we'll draw 3 prompts out of the jar, and if you want to write about the prompt the next time, you can. Or if you don't, then you don't. You can write about what you want, and I write about something special, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's how we came to be. We've been together for years in bits and pieces, thanks to Sara, and now we're together as a group of 9, and who knows, maybe more sometime.
I don't write to the prompts usually. I do a lot of experimenting with my writing, and I was sort of interested in examining different voices and presenting a story from different points of view, and in particularly different ways. So I started writing. I was a teacher my whole career, and I was very concerned about children who had very difficult lives. And I wanted to write a story about teen suicide, a teenager who committed suicide, and I wanted to tell her story, and I wanted to tell it in many different ways. I told it, and I probably would never have finished this story if it weren't for the group. They wanted to know what happened. So they would encourage me every time, well, what's next? Are you going to finish this? And I'm just about finished. I'm on the last chapter, so I'm proud of myself, and I'm proud of the group for making me go there.
The group sort of serves the same purpose for me in lots of ways. They actually, I see them as a very helpful set of ears who listen to my voice, and Sara knows I have an issue with voice. And although I'm the writer of the story, quite often I never take the time, although I'm reading bits and pieces as I'm writing it, I never take the time to read it aloud to myself. And quite often the first time I actually hear the story is when I read it to them. And what that does for me is I hear my words, and then, of course, they're listening to the words at the same time. But then, the impression that it makes, I often get back for the first time from them. They'll let me know if the words work or not. And it's very helpful. I tend to be very self-critical, as many of us are. but I think it helps me to just get the words on the page and then wait for the voice that comes out of here and then the voice that comes out of all of them to help me understand what it means. A little bit of helpful information about me for just a second. As I said, I've been wanting to write for years. I worked as a writer in PR and in higher education, and that's what I did. I edited catalogs and all sorts of things for many, many years, and then I wrote for 3 college presidents, their speeches and such, and so I felt like I didn't have a voice, and so I waited until I retired to figure out where that voice was going to come from. I did want to hear it at some time. And so I chose to try to give voice to the life of some nice people, my parents, who unfortunately are both gone, but they were tremendous people. And in addition to raising 5 kids of their own, they also raised about 23 foster children. And I was there for my 18 years of life and then went off to college, and they were still raising kids. So for about 30 years, they were raising children that were not even their own. And so I was there on vacations, and of course, my sisters are all still alive, so I used to hear stories from them. And a couple of summers ago, after my mother died, I actually went home and interviewed my sisters, and I even interviewed a couple of my foster sisters. And so I have all of their voices, their words, in a notebook, and I'm looking back at them, but I'm also trying to recall what I remember about the people who raised me and the people who raised all these children. And so that's what I write about when I come to the group. I sometimes will write a prompt, but more than likely I'll try to refer back to one of my interviews, or I have sort of a mental outline that's going. I don't know where the story is going exactly. I don't know if it's going to be a memoir. I don't know if it's going to be a piece of fiction. That's something that the group's been helping me with too. They seem to think that I do well with dialogue, though I don't think of myself being a person who writes a great deal of dialogue. So I'm working and trying not to fight with the voice and figure out where it takes me. So the group, just a couple words about the group. They've become familiar with my family. They're my critics in a kind of empathetic impartiality, if that makes any kind of sense. They're my cheering squad. They keep me motivated and try to keep me honest. If I come to group and I said, oh, I don't think I want to read today. Well, Joan says everybody has to read, and so you do. And I trust their judgment. I depend on their insights and their questions, and they provide a safe space for me. I'm a quiet person, although I've had a very public job working in higher education, but writing about myself and thinking about the people that are close to me, I don't trust very many people when I'm trying to give that story, give voice to those people. So that's what the group does for me. They're helping me to feel safe and to hopefully to create something. And I don't care if anybody ever reads it. I might like to be published, but if not, then I'd like to leave it as a gift in memory of my parents and to my sisters that are still alive. So with that, I want to read the next sort of the story that I called Running Toward Virtue. And it's a fictitious piece, but it's based on just a couple of words that one of my foster sisters said to me. I asked her in my interview with her, how did you come to live in Mama's house, and why was it important, and what was the house that you came from? And she said, well, the mother was nice enough and had 3 squares and sent me to school. And I said, but you seem to give off the feeling, the impression that you weren't happy there. And she said, well, there was a son there and he wasn't very nice. And that's all she said. She gave me no description, no details, and so she left me with feeling as though if I could say something for her, I'd like to give an impression of what those words, he wasn't nice, meant. So this is from Running Toward Virtue. When next to run was ever in her thoughts, last Thursday she sensed an opportunity had come. At Mass on Thursday morning, when Father had instructed the students to pray for a special intention, Hannah prayed to the Blessed Mother that Sister Regina would not give the 7th and 8th graders any weekend homework, including their assigned lines of a long poem, Invictus. Hannah and Nate hadn't quite mastered their 3 stanzas, but Sister would be pleased that they'd made a good effort. Hannah needed to leave several of her heavy textbooks at school and not have to lie. She needed the space to fold an extra white uniform shirt, clean undies and socks, and her extra navy sweater in her school bag. She knew by midweek she tried to leave. But Monday morning changed that plan. She could not wait another day. As she was about to leave her bedroom, she heard footsteps past her door. The bathroom door then closed. It now seemed safe to whisk by to the stairway and down to breakfast. But within seconds, Perry, the foster brother, stepped out of the bathroom into the narrow hallway. She paused for a second, then moved closer to the banister to walk by him as quickly as she could, but Perry stood right in her path. "Excuse me." She tried not to show her alarm. Occasionally, he'd let her pass unruffled, nearly unnoticed, but not today. "What's the hurry, little sister?" This was all too often the gauntlet of encounter. As he moved closer, she tried to move to the opposite wall. His face glistened with sweat. His thin cotton robe was half open. Her throat began to tighten as she tried not to inhale his manly odor permeating from the open bathroom. The thought of his muscular pressure against her crisp, clean school uniform would ruin the day before it had started. She felt repulsed, soiled by just his eyes. "Hannah! Nathan! You better hurry!" Mother Wilson's irritated voice rose from the bottom of the staircase. The bedroom door just beyond the bathroom opened, and Nathan rushed out. He knocked into Perry, throwing them both off balance for a second. "Watch out where you're going, you punk." Perry slightly shoved Nate with one arm, then turned and smirked at Hannah as he barely tugged the ties of his robe near his waist. Hannah's dampening eyes looked away. Nathan held his ground to let his sister pass, but Hannah stepped backwards into her room and firmly shut the door. Opening the top drawer of her small bureau, she quietly took out the plastic grocery bag with her provisions and placed them carefully in her school bag, which already held her loose-leaf binder. 2 magazines she had borrowed from Mother Wilson's dining room were the last items she placed in the bag. The bag then had its usual shape. This was indeed the day. Hannah sat waiting to hear what would happen to her. Beyond the door, the 2 voices continued, the unwitting, discredited mother and the unexpected substitute guardian, though Hannah couldn't clearly make out the words. One voice rose and quaked, started and stopped. The other flowed evenly, stopping only when the staccato tones interrupted. Shortly, only the even voice continued. There seemed to be no final refrain. The office door opened. Ms. Parsons entered the room alone. Hannah held her breath, waiting for Ms. Parsons to speak. Her social worker promised her that she wouldn't have to return to the foster home. Her words were direct, calm, and kind enough. She could believe her. For the week, Hannah could be placed in a temporary parent's home. There were few emergency settings, very few, where children could be placed overnight or sometimes for a few days. Hannah listened in silence, grateful for the words she heard, but she couldn't squelch the simultaneous roar of her hungry stomach. She cast her eyes down. Miss Parsons laughed for just a second and picked up the phone to call her contact where she hoped to take Hannah for the night. After a very short greeting, she asked if there was a space for a teenage client. How long before they might arrive? She must have been asked. "Oh, maybe a little over an hour. We have just one stop to make." "Great, see you then." She hung up the phone and grabbed her purse, then picked up the open folder on her desk and put it in a leather satchel. "Ever been to the Baltimore Streetcar Grill in Delhi? It's my go-to place for late nights." Hannah picked up her school bag. She felt safe for the moment and hungry. She was almost too tired to take in Ms. Parsons' friendly small talk. She began to think about the food she was about to receive. She hoped to find out soon what would happen to her brother, but for now, she was thankful for this moment of sanctuary, however long it might last. Thank you.
My turn?
Yeah.